Okay, welcome to the next episode of the Christ-Centered Cosmic Civilization, and we're thinking about the Talmud, the core body of material at the center of Judaism, but which is often referenced by Christian commentators of a particular kind, anyway, who we're just wanting to question that, because I personally, on an anthropological level, it's a fascinating body of material, and it helps to give us a great understanding of this important world religion and these people who are deriving culture and lifestyle and beliefs and values from this thing called the Talmud. So if I was studying this as an anthropologist or even a sociologist, it's fascinating in a different way. But why we're having to engage with it in a sort of biblical studies and theological way is because people, Christians, even modern Christians, reference this body of material, the Talmud, as a source for Christian theology and for understanding the Christian scriptures. And therefore, we have to kind of examine that a little bit more closely and say, is that a right thing to do? Is that a safe thing to do? And perhaps there are two reasons. First of all, I want to mention PJ is here from the Global Church History Project. And on all this material on Talmud, he's written, there are two papers that the Global Church History Project has produced on this, with huge amount of material and details, footnotes, very academic paper in a way, but absolutely fascinating. And that's why we've asked PJ on for this. And if you go to patreon.com/Global Church History, you will be able to get access to that. But in that, he notes that Christians ought to be concerned about referencing this material from a different religion, not just because of fears of cultural appropriation and what business is it of Christianity to go taking materials from a different religion, a different culture, to do that. But more theologically speaking, first of all, Protestantism, at its best, has had this passion for Sola Scriptura, the idea being, let us study the Bible itself and get the meaning of the Bible from the Bible, that the Bible will equip us with all we need in order to understand the Bible. And there is a kind of, this tradition of Judaism agrees with that, doesn't it? The Karaites. So I'll ask you to just talk a little bit more about them in a moment. So that's one reason for why we're investigating the Talmud and saying, is this a right thing to do, to abandon the principles of Sola Scriptura and go, no, actually, because rabbinical Judaism definitely doesn't believe in Sola Scriptura. It says, no, you cannot understand the text, the Hebrew text of the Bible on itself. You need oral traditions that floated around for 800 years that provide additional stories, background info, context, all sorts of things. And only when these two revelations, like this oral Torah, is put with the written Torah, then the two together give you understanding of the scriptures. So those two, so Protestants on the one hand will have a concern, should do, and say, whoa, hang on, this can't be right to draw from a tradition that is overtly and explicitly rejecting Sola Scriptura. And the whole that's at the core of the Talmud, a rejection of Sola Scriptura as a way of handling the Bible. It's literally saying you can't understand the Bible in itself. So that's one problem. But for Roman Catholics and Orthodox people, you highlight in your paper an additional problem, that the kind of things that the early church fathers believe about the Bible are directly rejected and attacked by the Talmud. And so it's like you can't, on the one hand, go, let us revere the authority and accuracy of the early church fathers, and also let us draw from the Talmud, because the Talmud goes against the early church fathers. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's especially strange when you think there's so... it's taken to be so definitive as like this is the text that all Jews believe, but then we've got Philo, Josephus, and then these other like the Karaites, and we've got even Kabbalistic stuff, and we might look at that, how different that is.
Why don't you tell us about those two things? A little bit more. You mentioned the Karaites last time. Why don't you tell us a bit more about them? And then I'd like to know more about this Kabbalah point.
Yeah. So they are connected in a very interesting way. So we've had the official, I suppose, rabbinist perspective on late antiquity, but the Karaites have a very different view of what was going on at the time. So the rabbinists believe that when the Romans took Jerusalem, they destroyed all the other sects, and all that was left were the Pharisees. And they say that they are the continuous Pharisees. The Karaites say quite differently that they are from the Zadokites, who were not the Sadducees. The Zadokites are Essenes, basically. When you read the Dead Sea Scrolls, they call themselves the sons of righteousness, the Banu Zadok, basically. And so that's who the Karaites say they are. So they say the other sects weren't annihilated, and they claim descent from the Essenes. And there's very good reason to believe them. The very first person to call himself, or to be called a Karaite, was a guy called Anan in the Abbasid Caliphate. So that's in, I think, the 9th century, I think he is. And he actually quotes from and uses the same exegesis as the Damascus document, which is the foundational document of the Essene community at Qumran. So when we thought about how the rabbinists deliberately cut themselves off from ancient literature by saying we won't read any and we won't preserve any, and then this guy quotes perfectly from the Damascus document, which we know is from antiquity, that proves that there were other Judaisms that survived the Roman conquest and preserved their different perspective. And
that is particularly important because this is a guy that quotes this Damascus document, which is part of the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the Essenes. And he's quoting that in, say, the 9th century, but we didn't have those Dead Sea Scroll documents in the modern age. We get them in the after the Second World War kind of thing. So, we couldn't have checked him, in the 17th century or something, said, oh, well, what are you quoting from? Whereas now we can check and we go, oh, yeah, this dude obviously has access to a body of written materials that what we know existed, and he's accurately quoting from it. So there are written texts that go back right to, possibly 300 BC, things like that, or 200 BC, whatever you want to cite that as. So there's this Essenes, the Dead Sea Scroll kind of community, and then Philo is also much more in harmony with that kind of Judaism, and they're very into writing things down and much more kind of that's kind of scholarly way of writing things down and publishing books and all that kind of thing. And then the Dead Sea Scroll community has that, and then the idea then is that kind of Judaism survives and obviously passes on its documents, because there's a guy in the 9th century AD who is able to quote from those documents. And so that there's strong evidence for the survival of another tradition of Judaism that wasn't based on these oral traditions the same, and had never rejected written documents.
Yeah. And there's actually another group known as the Sabians or the Mandeans, and they quote Essenes stuff, and they use a lot of words that we only ever see elsewhere in the Qumran community. And so they're like a Gnostic group, and they live in like Mesopotamia. But they claim to have been disciples of John the Baptist who left Israel when they rejected Jesus. And then, so it seems, given that everything, all the words and everything they're using is Essene, it seems we should kind of believe them. They are exactly who they say they are. Like people who had been followers of John who ended up rejecting Jesus, and so they went into exile into near Baghdad and, near Nineveh. That seems to be them. But then, of course, you think, well, that is quite interesting that they also survived and they have an equal claim to ancient Judaism, as would rabbinists and Karaites and things, and also shows that Essenism was stronger than was previously assumed. And so we have two quite large Essene strands of Judaism that survive. And we also know loads of early Essenes became Christians. Of course, there's loads of that stuff that's always very interesting. And then if we look at yet another Essene strand, when the Almohads and groups like those really ramp up the persecution of Jews and Christians in Iberia, loads of them have to flee, including Maimonides.
So this is now, we're talking about after the Islamic invasion of Spain, and then when that happens, there's an initial complete almost destruction of Christian civilization, universities, centers of learning. But then the policies they pursue are hostile to both Christians and Jews. And then at that point, Jews have to flee from Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they're quite well known to be very isolated from the rest of Judaism. They're often called Sephardic Jews. And they take all their documents with them, including the Damascus document, to Cairo. And so the Cairo Geniza has a Damascus document preserved, which was taken by an Iberian Jew. So in Iberia, there had been a continual Essenism. And then it's in Iberia around that time that we see Kabbalah form. And so we see like Maimonides and rabbinists like that. So Maimonides, we noted, did quote from the Talmud and the Mishnah especially.
So just tell us a bit more about this Maimonides guy. He's come from Spain and goes to Cairo.
Yeah.
And then Cairo becomes a center of scholarship, I suppose, in Judaism, a particular kind of it. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Maimonides so what we know then from the Damascus document is that there's lots of non-rabbinists who live in Spain, but Maimonides is a rabbinist who lives in Spain, so there's both of them going on. But he kind of turns Talmudic rabbinism to a scholastic direction. Him and Ibn Ezra and other Jews like that really try and ramp that up, and so they go really far down like a divine simplicity route. But the kind of Essenists aren't too happy with that, and so they respond with, like, Kabbalah.
So this is fascinating. So in Cairo, because of the persecution of Jews by the Muslims in Spain and things like that, Cairo is a collection point, and you've got the rabbinic Judaism that is detached from texts, really, and it has this idea of you need additional revelation alongside scripture to make sense of it. And so therefore they would regard philosophy as such a supplement, and therefore they'll say, yeah, there's the oral traditions, but we also will have Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy is something that can add revelation, add context. And then so with that, armed with all that, they introduce divine simplicity that and Greek philosophy into this concept of Judaism, and that's rabbinic Judaism that comes out of Cairo that has this kind of philosophical bent and an abstraction to it, and so on. But then there's this alternative kind of Judaism is like, no, they are obviously horrified with that kind of divine simplicity stuff, paganism, and they are like going to produce something that's got a more personalist feel to it. Tell us about that.
So in Kabbalah, it describes God as basically and intrinsically divided into what they refer to as sephiroths.
Sephiroths, right? Yeah. Okay.
So they say there's 3 supernal sephiroths that live in the uppermost realm, beyond the abyss where humans cannot dwell. And then there's 7 sephiroths that are a result of God, to an extent, the 3 supernals interacting with creation. And so you have 7 mundane sephiroths, 3 supernals. And so God is made up of 10 powers in Kabbalistic thought.
So, oh yeah, okay. I mean, obviously we're thinking the Trinity and the archangels, are we?
Yeah.
Go on, talk about that.
And so they do say that the archangels, they say, rule over sephiroths. And so we do obviously think about that idea where you've got the lampstand, and that has the oil leading into lamps, but the lamps are like separate. And so in Revelation, we see that the 7 lamps are the 7 angels, but the lampstand is the Spirit. And so we do see this, where the Spirit kind of like sends energies into these created beings and everything. And so they do say that the 7 holy archangels rule over the like 7 sephiroths, but the 7 sephiroths are like manifestations of God. They also believe, as did the Qumranists, as did Philo and so on, that the world is eternal. So that they believe that whole thing. So even though they link that to creation in some way, they also say that's intrinsic to God because they say creation has always existed.
Yeah.
So we've thought about Hules, how that was really the ancient Jewish opinion, and they went ex nihilo later.
So what a interesting time that must have been in Cairo, where you've got the Maimonides kind of guy who has lost all personal characteristics of God at all, and has ended up with really adopted a Neoplatonic one as an underlying concept of God, and then interprets the scriptures with the oral tradition stuff. So he's gone that route. But these lot are preserving this older kind of Judaism that has within it, like the Philo stuff, the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff. Hence it is kind of Trinitarian, basically, that intrinsic to God there are the 3 sephiroths, supernal sephiroths, and that's internal to God, the 3, because that notion of Trinitarianism within Judaism, there's a book been written about that, but you often come across that in medieval studies where you've got Trinitarianism as something that they might claim it isn't a Christian thing, it's a Jewish thing, and that Christians have stolen it. So these are Kabbalah people, and then they also have that the 3 supernal sephiroths, when they engage with the primal chaos and produce the creation, in that process are produced 7 mundane sephiroths, and then and we, from understanding what's really going on, we're like, oh, that's the Trinity and the 7 archangels, and we go, oh yeah, we can see exactly what the truth is in that. But then that's a fascinatingly different tradition to that rabbinical Judaism, isn't it?
Yeah. So they try and say, when the kind of Inquisition's after them, they try and say, oh, but we believe in like a divine essence that's simple and all that. So they kind of go that route a bit. But yeah, like you think intrinsically it does seem quite different from what Maimonides and Ibn Ezra and so on were after. And they also have when they talk about even the essence of God, though, they add a threeness, because then they talk about the light not limited, and they say each of those words, light, not, and limited, are like characteristics or faces. Sometimes they even say, personae in the divine nature. So they do have like not, which is like what you cannot comprehend, and that seems most like the Father, and then
is then the Kabbalah tradition, does that draw from Christian material, or just or Bible, or what's the sources for that?
Well, I reckon because of the Damascus document that rolls up and everything, I think to an extent, it is Christian sources insofar as we believe the Second Temple Jews were. But I think it does seem to be presented as, and there's a lot of, I haven't seen too much argument against it, that it does seem authentic to Judaism.
To original Judaism. But there's this other kind of Judaism, rabbinical Judaism, and that's another fascinating non-Christian religious tradition. But this, now help me with this. When I think about Talmud, sometimes often they go quote from what they call the Babylonian Talmud, as opposed to what are the differences between, how come that, because I thought the whole idea was it's locked down and there's only one Talmud, and it's orally collected in 200, written down in 550, commented on and expanded till 800, and then that's it. How come there are two Talmuds?
Yeah, so basically you have, as you say, the Babylonian Talmud, and mostly when they talk about the Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud, but there is an earlier one. How earlier, we don't know, but it seems as if that's the one the Babylonian Talmud is basing itself off of. This other one is called the Jerusalem Talmud, although it wasn't composed in Jerusalem. It's in the Levant, so sometimes they might call it the Israelite Talmud or the Levantine one. But they have two different kinds of Aramaic. One's written in, Levantine,
Western,
and it has Roman and Greek loan words. The other one is in Babylonian Aramaic, and it has Persian loan words.
So it's literally a division between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and each of those two empires has their own Talmud tradition. But the Jerusalem one, the Roman one, is considered to be earlier. How do we know it's earlier?
Well, for one, the wording agrees with the Rehob mosaic.
What is the Rehob mosaic?
So that is where we have a synagogue in the Roman Empire, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, and it has a text which describes how you're supposed to do farming in Israel, and some of the lines in it perfectly agree with the Jerusalem Talmud. Most of it doesn't. Most of it is lines that are not in the Talmud. There's some things that you would expect from the Talmud to be there that aren't. But so it represents a much earlier form of this oral tradition than is later crystallized in the Mishnah and so on.
So what I heard about that synagogue is though the synagogue itself goes back to, say, the 3rd century, so quite early, the relevant mosaic is probably from the 6th century, when the synagogue is expanded. And in that mosaic then, there is some text that completely coheres with the Jerusalem Talmud, but not the Babylonian Talmud. But there's other things there's other writings that isn't part of the Talmud either. And would that indicate that at that stage the Talmud is still in development, or there's a process going on?
Yeah, it does seem to be redacting for quite a long time. And as we thought, even in the 11th century, where you've got Maimonides, and he refers to the Talmud saying, we defer to the Greeks when it comes to philosophy. And then the Mishnahs we have now don't say that. So that it was still being redacted in the 11th century. But it just goes to show how much redaction could take place between one point and another. And the first kind of reference to there being a Talmud. So there we're seeing a reference to something we might recognize as a Talmud, but it's not calling itself that. But there is a letter, I believe, from the 8th century where someone refers to a Talmud.
So let's get this straight for a second. Even the early church fathers don't refer to the Talmud existing.
Yeah, there's Epiphanius and Jerome refer to the repetitions, And so Mishnah means the repetitions. So there may have been an early form of that going on. And if that PhD we talked about before, if that's correct, then that all tees up with what he's saying, really. Dr. Jeremy Tabik, his PhD, where he does say most of that content in it is from the 4th and 5th century. So that's when the church fathers start referring to the repetitions.
Right, so this is quite important as we gather our thoughts, really. So first of all, the claim that there is this body of oral traditions that are circulating for nearly 1,000 years, that, obviously, there's no evidence for that. Like, obviously. And the idea that the correct interpretation is being held in these oral traditions, what goes against that is there's Jesus, and he doesn't seem very happy with people's ideas. So where are the oral traditions? Like, whatever they contain in the 1st century when Jesus is interacting with people, they're not necessarily producing a correct view of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures, because Jesus seems fairly unhappy with what are called the scribes and the teachers of the law and so on. So the religious authorities there that he interacts with obviously don't correctly understand the Hebrew Scriptures, because Jesus says to them they don't. In its heart, what it's really all about, which is him. So there obviously isn't real clear evidence that there are all these oral traditions around and so on. Although the Apostle Paul does warn, saying don't have anything to do with these Jewish myths and legends. So he might then be saying, look, there are these sort of things circulating around, like additional stories that are claimed to be background info to the Bible. And he's says, don't have anything to do with them. Is that possible?
Yeah, that's certainly those techniques. I think there is a definite point that I personally think, and this obviously is just a theory, I don't have I have some things to back it, but it has to be constructed. But anyway, I believe rabbinic Judaism is Sadduceeism and Phariseeism linked together, because I think the rejection of prophets is actually key to rabbinism, but not really to Phariseeism, because Saints Philo and Josephus refer to prophets in their own time. Josephus loves one particular one called Jesus ben Hananiah, who keeps prophesying about the fall of Jerusalem till it is destroyed, and Philo believes a Septuagint is a prophetic word. So you have this real kind of break there where they say there's these years of silence and now you have to defer to rabbis because there are no prophets. And then John the Baptist comes and Simeon comes actually before. So you get Simeon, John, Jesus, who are clearly...
Anna,
yeah, you're right, we shouldn't forget Anna. And then these other ones that Philo and Josephus mentioned that we wouldn't have otherwise known, like the prophet Jesus ben Hananiah, who are all just prophesying, and the Pharisees kind of hate that, and the Sadducees hate it, and I think they kind of team up, because the Sadducees say we reject even anything written that isn't just the law of Moses, so they even reject the laws, the prophets and so on. I think rabbinic Judaism is them teaming up, like we see them team up against Jesus. Once Jesus becomes the stumbling block to them, they team up, and I think that's actually what rabbinic Judaism is
a rejection of the prophets. And that is enough to rejection of Jesus and this new batch of prophets that are all into Jesus kind of thing. And they go, we've got to stand against all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then that out of that, eventually you get rabbinic Judaism.
Yeah.
But there's this other kind of Judaism that's more in touch with Philo, Josephus as well, to a degree. But the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on.
Yeah.
And that...
and they don't believe prophecies ever came from them, doesn't it? They call themselves the prophets and the Qumran community, and the Bible agrees with them because Luke refers to Minian, who is a well-known Essene. He just calls him Minian the prophet. He's just like, that's exactly who the Essene community are. The Pharisees would hate to hear it, but it's true.
So what we're learning is that there are these different strands of Judaism that go on after the New Testament times and so on. but also that there are different kinds of what we call Judaism even before New Testament times going on, like with us the Essenes, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and so on. So we know they're going on at that time, and that there are different kinds of Judaism that carry on going on, and rabbinic Judaism is the one that like centers itself on this Talmud thing. There are other kinds of Judaism that don't do that and retain written texts that go earlier. And we're finding how fascinating Judaism is as like a collection of different traditions. But I think the word we want to say is, as fascinating as these things are, and yet there's a problem when Christian commentators believe that the Bible should be interpreted on the basis of this thing called the Talmud, or that it even is supplemental to, or it's good to quote from it, or things like that. But actually, lots and lots of things that people say nowadays, surprising number of things, in their biblical studies, they draw from the Talmud and quote it, or just say things like the Sanhedrin point you made. But there's other ones like it where there's these stories that circulate that are not in the Bible but are referenced in sermons, commentaries that actually come from the Talmud. And I think the challenge is to say don't do this. Like, have confidence in the actual Bible. Let's be like that other group of the Jews. Who were those ones?
The Karaites.
Yeah, the Karaites. They were just like, no, the Bible's enough. Let's just study it properly. And the Bible will give us what we need to understand the Bible. They did that.